My name is Kate McBrien. I'm the Maine State Archivist. Part of what I do is I lead the Maine State Archives for state government. So your wonderful tax dollars pay to actually maintain a state archives of state records that are created by agencies in their everyday business with all of you. Every agency creates a record. And so my agency is tasked with deciding which of those records need to be kept forever, which of those records really don't need to be kept forever. They're just not historic in nature. And so then how long should those really live? So we work with agencies to set up what we call records retention schedules. We decide when records will be destroyed, which ones will be kept, and the ones that are kept forever get sent to the archives. We catalog and share all of those, and we make them accessible to all of you. So the idea is that you were supposed to have access to everything created by state government. And so when you need access, you call me and the staff at the state archives, and we make it available to you. So that means really, in my mind, we are the key to a transparent government. If you want to know what your government is doing, you need the records to know it, right? So that's what we do. And how that all ties into Malaga is that actually this is the reason that we know so much of what happened at Malaga Island is because the government created records about the people at Malaga and sort of the decisions that they made about it and kept them. And so a lot of those records are still at the Maine State Archives, and we still make them available to people today. A lot of this research came from an exhibit that I developed for the Maine State Museum in Augusta. It opened in 2012. And there was a wonderful gathering of descendants to help open the exhibit and learn a lot about their family history and share it with the public in one of the first really public ways. There had been some news stories. There was a radio documentary, which was fabulous, but this just got it out more and more to more people who kind of tended to stumble on the story. So that's what a lot of the research is based on. Since then, I've done more, uncovered more, and opened up a lot of records that were held at the state archives that weren't always available before as well. So what we're going to talk about tonight is a bit about what Malaga Island is, what the community is that lived there, why they were there, and then what happened to them, and the state government's role in that and what happened to them. So Malaga Island, how many of you have been there before? Yeah, I love it. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's an absolutely beautiful spot. It is located at the mouth of the New Meadows River in Phippsburg. It's just about 42 acres. It's really rocky, scruffy, covered with pine. And it is really quite small compared to most islands. As you can see, it's nestled right in between mainland, sort of Sebasco area, and Bear Island, to the point where at low tide, you can actually walk from Malaga to Bear. You used to do it more, but you still can. And there are several theories for how the community who came to live on Malaga Island got there. Most of them trace back to one gentleman. His name was Benjamin Darling. He was an African-American man, we believe a formerly enslaved person, who somehow made it to Maine. We don't really know how he made it to Maine. One of my favorite stories, and one that's really popular, is that he was on a ship with the gentleman who owned him. There was a massive storm and the ship sunk, and he saved the person who owned him. He saved his life. And in thanks for that, he was awarded his freedom. No idea if that story is true or not, but it's a fabulous story and really fits in with the whole seafaring history of coastal Maine as well. But either way, we know that Benjamin Darling was here in Maine because in 1794, he purchased Horse Island. So that it was actually an island right near Malaga. And that was where he raised his family. He married a local woman named Sarah Proverbs. She was white. They raised their family on Horse Island and lived there until the family kept the island until about the 1850s, when they actually sold the island. We're not sure why, but his sons sold the island. And from there, they kind of scattered to other nearby islands. The reason for this is that while islands right now are wonderfully desirable places to live, in the 1700s and the 1800s, they were pretty difficult places to live. You know, you're separated from the mainland, you're separated from people and resources and help. Certainly a place like Malaga Island, you couldn't grow a lot of food, so it would have been a difficult place to live. So for the most part, if someone just set up a home on an island, nobody was particularly bothered by that. Nobody cared because no one else was really using the space. It wasn't desirable land. And that's really what Benjamin Darling's descendants did, is they scattered to these other islands and they set up home and raised their own families there. Although records aren't totally clear, we believe Henry Griffin, who had married a Darling descendant, he and his family were probably the first ones to set up home on Malaga Island, probably around 1863. Very quickly, a settlement kind of developed around them. They set up home on the north end of the island. It's really the only sort of beach, easy landing spot, a more protected space, sort of the only space in the island that's nice and flat and a good place to build homes. So they all quickly set up some homes. It was mostly a Darling descendant and then a cousin and then a sister. And so there was usually some sort of family or community connection, but very quickly a very small settlement built up on the north end of the island. There were about 8-10 homes at its peak. Usually around, I think it grew to about 45 people at one point. But being an island, people would live on the island, they'd move off, they'd go to the mainland. It was rather fluid. You know, people would be there for a few years, then they'd move on. But it tended to be mostly Darling descendants who gathered there. And life on Malaga Island was really just the same as it was on any other island in Maine. Members of the community who lived here, they were poor. They all fished. Everybody was a fisherman in some way. And then most of them had some other job as well. Some worked on the mainland doing odd jobs. One woman took in laundry. She would bring it back to Malaga and clean the clothes there. They all did whatever work they could and certainly did the best that they could living on an island. And unfortunately, many myths grew up about this secluded community. I think probably it is my personal opinion, but based on a lot of research, that a lot of the myths grew up because it was a mixed race community. It became a community of Black and white people living together, marrying, raising kids, having families, and that stood out as different in Maine. And we all know it, anytime there's something different, stories start to spread. People start to talk, they start to pay more attention. Well, myths did and stories spread around the coast about this community. Unfortunately, they ended up being stories about theft and inbreeding, illiteracy. There was actually tales, they would refer to this as a degenerate colony where incest and wife swapping happened. I even saw a newspaper article that claimed that the children were living in tunnels on the island and they had horns growing out of their head. I mean, this is how far these myths and these stories went. It was just ridiculous, but it actually got printed in newspapers. It was to that extent. And unfortunately, it went so far as to have postcards that were printed and sold of community members. These are actually two people who lived on Malaga Island. I know the child is Pearl Tripp. I believe the woman's whose lap she's sitting on is her grandmother, Elizabeth Darling. And this is a photograph that was taken of them on Malaga Island. Unfortunately, as you can see in the bottom corner, it was titled a very racist title. This was a postcard that was sold nationwide. So news about this community spread fast. And spread far. I saw newspaper articles as far as Utah and Oregon. So people on the West Coast were reading about Malaga Island. But in the corner it says, and I apologize for the title, but it says The Deuce of Spades, Malaga Island, New Meadows River, Maine. So these are the stories that were spread. This is what people are reading. This is the only thing that they're hearing about this community. But what a lot of historians and archaeologists began to wonder is, well, if these are the stories, is any of that even true? Where does that come from? And what they found is that no, it wasn't true. Reality was really very different. Families certainly were poor. They struggled to meet a lot of their needs, but they built their homes. They educated their children as much as possible. They interacted with the mainland on a daily basis, very peacefully and whenever needed. This is an actual photograph, not a staged postcard photograph, but an actual photograph of another family living on Malaga Island. This is the Murphy family. And you can see it's just a very different impression from this. This gives you one impression, right? This one gives you a very different impression of what life would be like on the island. So we know some of this partially because some University of Southern Maine archaeologists spent 8 years on Malaga Island digging at the sites of 3 homes. They were looking for the actual artifacts, the physical evidence that could tell us about how these people really lived, not how someone was saying they lived at the time, but their objects that could actually tell us. They dug at the house sites of the McKinney household, the Henry Griffin house, and the Eason house site. And you can see these are pictures of the holes that the archaeologists dug in where they were working. This stratigraphy of the ground, you can see it's not really good soil, right? This is actually all shell middens. The people on Malaga Island built their homes on top of shell middens, which they used kind of as their foundation. So that's where the archaeologists dug. And in doing that, they found an estimated 50,000 shards of material just from those 3 house sites. They found generally that the island community lived like any other Maine island community. They worked, they cooked meals, they cleaned their house. A lot of their possessions were a little older, possibly secondhand. Ceramics tended to be styles that were really popular decades before, but still completely usable. Although some households like the Easons actually had several items that were current for the early 20th century, like this bowl, which came from the Eason house. They found that they used clay pipes, and the clay pipes were really common in the 18th and 19th century for smoking. They found thousands of fragments of clay pipes all over the island. They also found fragments of textiles and shoes, really showing that they were kind of using everything up until they just couldn't use them at all. So what I want to do is really kind of take a look at who some of these people were. What did this archaeology and some of the archival research really show so that we could learn more about who they are? So first, we're going to start with the Griffins, since they were the first family to live on the island. This is actually the Griffin home, right on the north end, right by the beach of Malaga. Henry and Tina Griffin, as I mentioned, probably were the first ones to live there. They moved in the mid-1860s. We think about 1863. Henry came from the Small Branch near Small Point in Phippsburg. And Tina, she was the darling. She actually grew up on Bear Island. And then when she married Henry, they moved to Malaga to set up their family home. Henry, in all the census records, was listed as a fisherman. The McKinney family were probably the second family to live on Malaga. This is their home. James Eli McKinney was the son of some Phippsburg residents. So he grew up in Phippsburg. He was, according to most records, white, Scotch-Irish descent. And it was actually his second marriage to Salome McKinney. To Salome, where he actually raised his family here on Malaga. This is their home. They had what was considered the best home on Malaga. It was sort of the biggest, the nicest. And because James Eli McKinney was considered the best fisherman, he was also referred to as the King of Malaga. The very first recorded birth on the island was their daughter, Louisa. She was born April 15th, 1871. And I say it's the first recorded birth because births were only recorded if someone thought to actually report them to the town office and file the paperwork. They weren't very consistently recorded in the 1870s. So this is the first one that we know definitely happened on Malaga Island. And this is Louisa. You see her pictured here with her 3 sons. She married John Murphy, and they raised their children, at least in the young ages, on Malaga Island as well. So she grew up there. Her dad, James, as I said, was known as the King of Malaga. He really became the leader of the community and acted as the spokesperson for the community quite a bit. He's the one we see interviewed in newspaper articles the most. I tend to think that newspapers probably spoke to him the most because he was the white guy on the island. They probably would have felt more comfortable approaching him and speaking with him. But he is the one that we see referred to as King of Malaga through lots and lots of articles. He also was known for his fiddle playing, and he would actually travel up and down the New Meadows River performing for communities. Sure. Thanks, Carol. We are very fortunate to have a Malaga descendant, a Darling descendant, a McKinney descendant here. And this is James Eli with his fiddle, which is pretty amazing, actually. I'm going to kind of show it for those of you on Zoom. This is it, which is pretty neat. It's amazing, actually, that you have this photo. And I have the original. Incredible. So in 1916, Jim McKinney was actually, in 1916, he passed away. In his obituary, he was described this way. Jim McKinney was perhaps the most picturesque character that lived on the little emerald island of Malaga. He seemed to possess a little more education than the others on the island, and they accordingly carried all their troubles to him, and he settled them. So he was really seen as sort of the leader of the community. The Easons were another family that the archaeologists explored. John Eason, who you see pictured here, was a stonemason and a carpenter. Just like everyone else on the island, though, he also fished, so he was also a fisherman. He was known for doing a lot of building on the mainland, but also for traveling around performing, because he was known for his fine singing voice as well. And on the island, they nicknamed him the Deacon because he would actually preach to the islanders when they couldn't make it to the mainland to attend church. He married Rosella Griffin, and they lived on Malaga Island. You can see Rosella pictured here. What I love about this photo, it's actually a glass plate negative that's held in the collection of the Maine State Museum. And until we can zoom in, none of us could really tell that she's holding their pet cat in the photo. So that's their cat. And this is actually the full photograph. And I just love this photograph because it really shows the family, their whole house, their setting, their surrounding as well. And this is a wonderful photo to really try to tell us a lot about sort of who they were and how they lived. When you look at this photo, and very often we look at photos, we just very quickly make assumptions based on what we see. When you look at this photo, what's the first thing that you think of? What do you assume about the people who are pictured here? Anything? Family? Yeah. I'm sorry?
Pride.
Pride.
Well-dressed.
Well-dressed, nice.
What year did they do the archaeology dig?
They started in 2006. I'm going to look at Carol. 2006, 2008. It's right around there. No, by 2008 they're done. By 2001, I think. Is it that early? It was about 8 years, and I started doing the research in about 2008 actively for the exhibit, and they'd already finished by then. So I think it was around very early 2000s, let's just say that. Nice and big. But that is when they started working. And up until then, there had been no archaeology digs. The island had been owned by private individuals, a series of different private individuals, but it had always been held privately, and no one had given permission until Maine Coast Heritage Trust bought the island. And I think they bought it in like 2002, so it must have been right around there. And then with that, they were able to give permission for archaeologists to work on the island, and we were able to find out so much more. So this is the Eason family in front of their home. And like I said, it's taken just a few days in between when the island decided that the government decided, the state government decided that the island was owned by the Perry family. But then they don't really know when this photo is taken, they don't really know what's going to happen from there. So let's take a look at that a bit. Hear my phone vibrating. We're going to ignore that. So why was this community evicted from Malaga Island? Any guesses?
Money.
Money? Yep. Prejudice, definitely that too. Bless you. Anything else? Fear? I think definitely. I think like anything in history, and this is something I always try to stress to everyone, to me, all parts of history are always complicated. There's never one clear answer. It's usually many different reasons, many different things happening at once. And that's really what happened to the folks on Malaga Island as well. They got caught in a time of lots of change. Remember, they had lived on the island since the 1860s. And for a good, 30, 40 years, everyone knew they were there. As so many of you know, Malaga Island is so close, you can see it from the mainland. It's not like anything was hidden out there. So they'd lived there for 40 years without anyone really caring or bothering them or being, too upset about it. But by the early 20th century, so many things in Maine and in America were changing. And the folks on Malaga Island got caught up in that. Part of it was there was a decline in the shipbuilding industry all around this area, certainly hit Phippsburg very hard. Shipbuilding was the major industry of the town. And when we no longer needed to build wooden ships, well, people lost their jobs. People's businesses failed. So there's a massive economic decline at the time, particularly on the coast of Maine. At the same time, we also saw a drastic decline in the amount of fish that were available in the area. So you saw increased competition among fishermen. And remember, everyone on Malaga Island fished. So they were seen as competition with everyone else. And then as these jobs disappeared and more people were competing for resources, at the time, the way to get some help, some assistance was to apply to your town for some financial assistance, for food, for medical bills, for some basic needs. That was the system we had in place at the time. And so that's what the folks on Malaga Island did. But so did so many other people in Phippsburg. So the town of Phippsburg town government began to feel like there was too much pressure, there was too much need, there was too much ask. And the need was only growing. So with that, coastal towns like Phippsburg began to look for, well, what is the new industry that can improve our economy, that can help our residents? And they all turned towards tourism as being the answer to our economic problems. At the very same time that all of that is happening, the eugenics movement began to thrive in America. Have you all heard of the eugenics movement before? Most of us have heard of it in association with the Holocaust. That's what a lot of the theories were based on. But the eugenics movement actually started much earlier than that in Europe and in America. And by the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was beginning to thrive in America. It was this belief that all of society's problems, all the issues that we were trying to deal with, behavioral issues, were based on genetic traits within a person and could be corrected by correcting those genes, by making sure a family did not procreate, by separating communities, because it was all based on a healthy gene pool, is what eugenicists believed and how they looked at it. So this was a leading theory that was beginning to take hold in medicine, in science, in government, in education. It was widespread. It was under the eugenics movement that some really commonly used terms such as moron, imbecile, even juvenile delinquent and gifted children, those are all terms that come out of the eugenics movement. Because again, we thought intelligence and intellectual ability was all based on what could be passed down through a gene pool. And these were all things like moron, imbecile became scientific medical diagnoses that were applied to people. Associated with the eugenics movement became a lot of social movements and groups who thought that they could work to really better, or at least better in their opinion, the lives of some groups. For the folks on Malaga Island, the missionaries who found them and offered help were George and Lucy Lane. They were missionaries from Malden, Massachusetts. They had bought a summer home on Horse Island, and they actually came to the coast of Maine looking for a project. It's actually how they put it. In a letter in 1911, George Lane wrote to a friend and he said, I quote, "We built our summer house on the north end of Harbor Island," which was then Horse Island, "and being interested in looking after people who need help, found what I was looking for on Malaga Island." And they began to work with the people on Malaga. This was about in 1906. They actually really focused on educating the children and the women on Malaga. They never seemed to mention educating the men. They were just focusing on the children and the women to provide them with an education, and as well as to teach them moral values, is how they put it. In 1906, they actually opened up the island's first school. They operated it from one home of the McKinney House, which you can see here. And they had their daughter Cora serve as the teacher. By the next year, the school actually grew in such popularity, they had to move to the larger room in the McKinney House because they were actually running out of space. And with that, the Lanes actively raised funds. They started to visit philanthropists, wealthy people in Portland, in Boston, New York City, and raising money to help pay for a school that they wanted to build on Malaga Island. Also to help pay for some supplies that the residents would need, clothing, school books, food, that sort of thing. And so they were able to do that. And by 1908, they actually built a school building on Malaga Island, which you see here. The state actually paid for a teacher to go out and live on the island in the summer months and teach to the people on Malaga. She had a room right in the school building. And the school was so successful that one student from the mainland actually paid tuition and would row out to the island to attend school there. And as you can see, this is actually a letter that one of the children on Malaga wrote. So you can see they did get some education. They learned to read and write. They were taught mathematics and history. I saw one letter that mentions that they were introduced to some trades. So that may have been part of the education as well. This is a letter to Mrs. Lane, Mrs. Lucy Lane, from Abby Marks, who was a child on Malaga Island. She's asking Mrs. Lane if she will come to visit her soon. So how did all this, so there's all this work happening on the island. How do we end up with eviction? How do we get to separation? Well, as if you remember that economics, that money part of it, Phippsburg's feeling a lot under pressure. They're feeling threatened. They're not sure how they're going to handle all this. They also want to really improve their visibility and their image to attract more tourists and more summer residents. So in 1903, Phippsburg actually sent a petition to the state legislature and said, we don't think Malaga Island is actually part of Phippsburg, so we're not responsible for their financial upkeeping. We think that Malaga belongs to Harpswell, and Harpswell is supposed to pay for them. The legislature said, yeah, no way. Nice try. We disagree. Malaga is definitely part of Phippsburg. But there must have been something there. It definitely caught the state's notice because by 1905, the state made the island residents wards of the state, which meant the state would actually oversee their care. They appointed an agent to act on behalf of the state. He was supposed to, he was a local Phippsburg resident, and he was supposed to go in and check in on the residents, make sure they had food, pay their grocery bills, pay their medical bills, and sort of be the communication between the island and the state. So he's usually communicated with the executive council. At the time, Maine State Government had a governor, and then we also had an executive council to run our day-to-day operations. The executive council no longer exists, but their records are amazing because literally every single interaction, everything that went through state government went through that executive council. They paid all the bills, they approved all the appointments, they took in all the reports. So it's like a treasure trove of information. And it's all at the Maine State Archives. So as I mentioned, the state did appoint an agent, George Pease. He was a resident of Phippsburg. And for a number of years, from 1905 until 1911, he continued to pay bills, but he would actually say, you know, we need more resources. The residents need more. He did a lot of the coordinating of the work between the state and the missionaries. And in 1911, George Pease issued this report that you see here. This is the last 2 pages of the report. He issued a report to the Executive Council listing his recommendations on what he thought should happen to Malaga Island. He went through and he listed each of the families who lived there. He described them using very racist and very eugenics-based terminology. He made sure with every single person, he described their race. He described his opinion on their intelligence level, their work ethic, what could be done with them. He then, at the end of the report, recommended that the state should own Malaga Island. He actually says, in order to turn off the undesirables. So he says the state should own the island, turn off these people. He then goes through and lists, you know, this family, you can pay them a small amount of money. They'll find another place to have a home. This family, you can, you know, we'll probably go to this other family and they'll figure it out. He suggested that one child should be sent to the Bath Military Orphanage, which was here, because she was the daughter of a veteran. She suggested that Willie Marks, who was a 2.5-year-old child in the Marks family, that he could be given to a woman in Portland because she wanted him. And then he also, at the end, says, a few people can remain on the island because they are old and probably won't live long anyways. And this was his very official report and recommendation to the state. And the reason I always point this report out is I think it's very telling in how the Maine State Government viewed the people who lived on Malaga Island. They viewed them as a problem, as something to be dealt with. How do you fix a problem? What is the solution? They weren't looking at them as individuals, as families with homes, and this island that had been their home for 50 years at this point. It was a problem to be dealt with. And it was a problem viewed through racism and through eugenics, as this report really shows.
What did the missionaries that went to the island play in this getting people moved to the island? And were the records kept of these missionaries that went to the island and the conditions that they found there? And did that, at the end of it, did they use these missionaries in the story that the story must have been coming from these missionaries to whoever, what time did that, I know they thought, what did that play?
What did that play in there?
Someone saying, yeah, this is
a problem or something.
We better get,
yeah.
And I'm wondering if it was the British part, if those records were kept, or was any records kept?
Kind of. Kind of. So, and that's a,
Will you repeat the question?
yeah. For those of you on Zoom, the question was, what role did the missionaries really play in some of the stories that were being told to the government and the urging for eviction or the plans of what could happen to the people who live there.
Or their own beliefs.
Or their own beliefs, exactly, their own beliefs. There are some records. The New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston, Massachusetts owns a scrapbook that was created by a friend of the missionaries. And it says right on there, it's to document the work of the Lanes on Malaga Island. And it includes photographs, it includes letters that the Lanes wrote, it includes some letters from the state saying, yes, we will send a teacher. That's actually where the handwriting from the kids comes from, because they were using it. The scrapbook, I think, was a fundraising tool. The missionaries were going around to rich people who could donate money, and they would use it to say, this is what we can do. This is what we found. This is what we can do. And the reason I say that is there's numerous pages, but one page in particular, there's a photograph of Abby Marks. And the photograph shows her looking really dirty, really scruffy, hair all tangled, very sad kind of face. And then there's another photo of her under that, all very clean, hair combed, beautiful white dress. And the pictures are labeled Abby as she was, Abby as she is now. And I think that was their way of saying, this is how we found her. This is what we can do. And so same with the letters from the kids, it was, they weren't educated, and look, now they're writing us thank you letters for all the things that we can do. And most of those are, thank you for the blackboard, thank you for the books. When can you come to visit? That kind of thing. There are some letters at the Phippsburg Historical Society now between, mostly from the missionaries, I think, but between the missionaries and some of these philanthropists, where when the state actually decides to evict, there's some letters back and forth where people are thinking, well, should we hire a lawyer? How can we help the people? There wasn't always a clear sense of they should stay on the island, but it's how can we help them? There is definitely one letter from a lawyer, though, who says, don't even try to fight the state. You're not going to win. So it looks like there may have been some exploration of, well, could they stay there? Should they? Can we help them? But it was pretty quickly shot down from what I can tell. But unfortunately, the letters that we have at Phippsburg Historical are mostly, I think, what was sent to the Lanes. So we don't have their letters out necessarily. But with this report, which I do think part of with the missionaries going out with this fundraising and telling all these people, I think it helped to spread the word that it's almost like they were walking around in a community saying, hey, look at this different community. You may not be aware of them, but we're going to tell you. And if you give us money, we can do some work there. It's almost like they spread the word even more than it would have been otherwise. So I think they were part of the publicity around some of these myths. Yes.
Quick question.
Yep.
What was the date of that executive report?
That was, I have it exactly. That was, I believe, June 1911. So right after that report was issued, Governor Plaisted, who was governor at the time, visited Malaga Island with his executive council. They wanted to actually see the island for themselves. The governor reported, and this was actually such a big deal, that there was a postcard made of the governor landing on Malaga Island. This is how much the story had gotten out there, that they actually issued and sold a postcard of it. And after that visit, the governor reported that he was encouraged by the progress of the children in the school, but he was not convinced the community would ever, as he put it, would ever accept a middle-class style of living. He actually wrote or remarked, as reported in the newspaper, the best plan would be to burn down the shacks with all their filth. Certainly the conditions are not credible to our state, and we ought not to have such things near our front door. And I do not think that a like condition can be found in Maine, although there are some pretty bad localities elsewhere. And this is what was reported in the newspaper. And it was pretty soon after this. It was a report of the Executive Council. And they actually devoted an entire section to Malaga Island in this report. And there they wrote, there has been heretofore, and some are existing at the present time, certain pauper colonies that have been for years a disgrace to the adjacent communities and a blot upon the state. We refer particularly to Malaga Island, Athens, and Frenchboro. I never saw any state action in Athens or Frenchboro, by the way, just Malaga Island. The report then went on to describe the decision to evict the islanders this way. After viewing conditions, it was decided at a council meeting shortly after that the good of the state and the cause of humanity demanded that the colony be broken up and the people segregated. Basically, to prevent further squatting, the state decided it should hold title to the island. So as I said, as I mentioned, Portland and Boston philanthropists were working with the Lanes. They really became concerned about this. This letter actually, which is in the Phippsburg Historical Society collection, this letter was written by Augusta Hunt. She was a wealthy woman in Portland who had been very involved in the Malaga Island community and the missionaries working there. She wrote this letter right before the governor visited the island. She wrote this letter to Mrs. Lane. And I think this kind of tells us a bit about how the missionaries and certainly how the philanthropists were viewing the people on Malaga. There seems to be some genuine concern for the people who lived there, but it's also from a very patronizing perspective. And I'll actually read this as a good example of it. In this letter, she wrote, "Dear Mrs. Lane, I think you ought to know that on Friday next, the governor and council with 3 ladies are expecting to visit Malaga Island. We leave by special steamer at 9 o'clock. Please do not let the people on the island know of this visit, as I am anxious to have the men see conditions just as they are and without comment. It would be all right for Cora to have the children in the school building when we arrive. That might be the best way for the men to see them. I don't want them dressed up, but if possible, clean in general appearance. If we have them looking unusually well on the island, it might seem as if we had exaggerated their needs. But you and Mr. Lane can give the men just what they wish to know in information." So again, it's that very, we're going to set the stage, we'll set the scene, and this is what we're going to present to the people who will then make decisions about what happens to this community. I mean, I don't know about you, but if the governor was coming to visit my house, I'd kind of like to know that. I might clean up a little bit. I might not open the door in my pajamas, you'd want to know that. But no, they were told not to tell them. And that, I think, was really kind of the approach. They wanted to help them, but they didn't want to ask them how to help. They didn't want them to necessarily be part of that discussion, that conversation. So it's a very patronizing kind of help. So with that, the governor and the executive council did order an eviction. They let the people on Malaga Island know they had to be out of their homes by July 1st, 1912. They gave them a bit of time to figure out what to do with it. But on December 9th, 1911, a local doctor who was also a member of the executive council signed papers committing Anna Parker and the entire Marks family to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. In that same month, the state purchased Malaga Island from the Perry heirs, the Perry family, for $471. As I said, the residents were told they had to vacate the island by July 1st of 1912. Some of the residents were given a token sum of money for their houses, but no alternative homes were provided or land suggested. They were just told they had to leave. They had to go find places on their own. When Agent Pease arrived on the island on July 1st, 1912, he arrived with the sheriff, ready to evict everyone. But what he actually found was something a little different. What he found was that everyone had already left. And not only had they left, they took all their homes with them. And what I love about that is that when you are a person who has no power, no say in what's going to happen, you try to find the one thing you can control, the one thing that you can say, this is how I'm going to respond. And for the islanders, it was, I can decide when I leave and how I leave, and I'm going to take all my things with me. So I think it was their one way of saying, this is the part I can control, and I will. At the end of 1912, after the eviction was completed, the state of Maine sold Malaga Island to the highest bidder. They sold it for $1,650. So they also made a profit on the island.
They sold it to?
They sold it to a gentleman whose name I'm going to blank on, but I can find that for you. But he was a friend of someone on the executive council. And we actually, at the state archives, we have the list of bids, and he was the highest bidder. Right before the state actually sold the island, they sold it in December of 1912, but the month before, in November of 1912, the state of Maine exhumed the remains of the cemetery on Malaga Island. They moved the bodies to the cemetery at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. They exhumed the bodies of 17 people, and they combined them into 5 caskets, 5 cemetery plots at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, and that's where they remain buried today. Again, we actually have the cemetery notebook that shows who is in what plot and how that was combined.
Is that easy to find at Vineland? We're going up.
It is. It is. If you look for on their map, I think they show the cemetery. It's kind of just off of their grounds, but adjacent. And then you'll see there's actually a large memorial there now for the people of Malaga. So you'll see it right there. So one family that was particularly devastated by the events on Malaga Island was the Marks family. This is Jake Marks, Jacob Conrad Marks. He was the son of John Marks and Hannah Darling. So again, sort of that Darling family connection. He married Abby Darling, and they had 4 children who you can see here. And again, this is the family that was institutionalized in the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, the entire family. But again, that goes with that eugenics theory, that if one person is deemed to be a problem, to have an intellectual disability, something, they assume that the entire family would then. Abby Marks and her daughter Lottie were the only members of Malaga Island residents to be released from the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. All the rest of their family died there, which you can see here. And pretty quickly, some of them. Lottie and Abby actually both moved here to Bath. They lived in a local house and served as housekeepers. At the bottom of the list, you'll see the name Willie Marks. That's that 2.5-year-old child that George Pease recommended be given to a woman in Portland because she wanted him. The state ultimately did not do that. Instead, they sent him to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. He entered the institution just before he was 3. He spent the rest of his life there. He died there at the age of 19. They were all institutionalized under the medical diagnosis of something like low-grade moron, imbecile, middle grade. That's what put them into an institution. And again, we have all of those patient files at the Maine State Archives. We've now made them available and put them online so you can access them as well. As I mentioned, Lottie was one member of the Marks family that was released from the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. She eventually married, but she actually married twice, never had any children of her own. She died in 1997 in an Augusta, Maine nursing home. She was 103 years old. To her dying day, she often talked about having American Indian heritage, never African-American heritage. She would talk about Malaga Island. She would talk fondly about childhood memories of fishing, digging clams there. She actually wanted to be buried on Malaga Island, but that never happened. She's buried in Brunswick instead. And of course, she always denied ever having been at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. Other residents of Malaga Island really scattered to other nearby homes. They would set up other nearby towns. They would set up home wherever they could. This is John Eason, that carpenter and stonemason. We saw the picture of him building a house. This is him in Cundy's Harbor in 1934. He set up his home there. And I swear to God, that is, if that's not the house from Malaga Island, he managed to at least completely rebuild a replica of it. I mean, that is the house. So today, Malaga Island is a nature preserve. It's owned by Maine Coast Heritage Trust. They do an amazing job to preserve it. That also means that it's open to the public. You can all go there. You just have to get yourself there. You know, a good canoe or kayak, though, it's not far. It's pretty easy to get to. And there's a lovely nature trail going all around the island. So I highly recommend visiting. I just also recommend staying on the path and on the beach because it is otherwise covered in poison ivy. Yeah, you don't want to wander off. When you go to Pineland, you will see this memorial. In 2017, a group of us dedicated a memorial to the people of Malaga Island, but we placed it at the cemetery at Pineland, mostly because that's where a tangible place where people from Malaga were. There's a place to remember them. There was also the state of Maine established a scholarship fund around the same time for descendants of those who were evicted from the island. I'm very pleased to say that the state gave $250,000 for the scholarship fund. We've given it all away already. So it's sent lots of people to school, which is absolutely wonderful. So as I mentioned, there are some wonderful resources online if you'd like to learn more about Malaga. There's the Maine State Museum website. I can send all of these links to anyone so you don't have to try to write them down. I do highly recommend searching for Malaga Island, a story best left untold, which is a radio documentary. It's a really good piece, a good introduction to the story. And you can actually hear from some of the descendants and some of the people, which is so important because it's their story, it's their history. And as I mentioned, at the Maine State Archives, we have digitized a lot of these records and put them online so that you can see them. You can see the original documents and read the original words of the people who made these decisions. There are pauper records from the Secretary of State's collection. There's all the Executive Council records, and there are the case files from the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded for the Marks family. The only one that's not on there is Lottie's file, and the reason is because per HIPAA law, we can't share medical information until 50 years after a person's death. She didn't die till 1997, so we have to wait 50 years after that to share hers. Everyone else died more than 50 years ago. So, you know, 75 years ago, 100 years ago. But all of this, if you go to the Maine State Archives website, right on the right-hand side, you'll see a link to our digital records and you can find it all there, or you can get in touch with me and I'll send you some links. But we tried to make it as open and accessible as possible. And that's it.